going to try and summarize the talks that we've had, which do kind of come under the theme of this session, which was together. And I've been thinking a lot about kind of how we have the science and the scientists sort of in the middle who are perhaps neutral in a way, and the way in which we communicate to the public and the way in which we communicate to the policymakers and the entrepreneurs and the governments and the leaders. And there's kind of a lot there to process. And I guess, yeah, so probably most of my questions will be open for anyone to answer. And I've gone through most of the Slack and have some questions here already. So I'm going to start with one by Robert Massey, which is thinking about, the role of scientists as experts and the way in which we try and give expert advice to, say, leaders and governments. But what about scientists becoming, say, political campaigners themselves? Is that possibly something that is needed in order to speed up action in terms of, say, governments that aren't doing enough? Maybe we do actually need to get our hands dirty and get involved with politics ourselves. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Sure, I'm happy to start out. So, indeed, there is an important role for the scientist in our public discourse. And this is an argument I've been making for years. I know others have as well. We need, as a community, to provide resources, especially for young scientists who are interested in outreach and public engagement. It's not something that we should demand of all scientists, that they be trained in communication and that they take on a role in the larger policy discourse. But my feeling is we do need to provide resources for those young scientists who do have an interest and a proclivity for engagement. Now, when it comes to the issue of activism and political activism, my view is that there is no one size fits all. Each of us has to find our own sort of comfort level when it comes to how we engage. I think there's an important distinction, for example, between advocacy and activism. So advocacy is simply by going out and talking about the science and its implications, you're engaged in advocacy. There's a reason that we want people to listen to what we have to say about the science, about the impacts, about the potential policy dimensions of the problem. And we shouldn't apologize for being advocates for an informed public discourse. And I wrote an op-ed some years ago, back in 2014, for the New York Times, the title of which was, "If you see something, say something." And that motto is actually taken from the Department of Homeland Security here in the United States. And it was really in the wake of the 9/11 events and the need for the public to pay attention to what's happening and report things that might be of concern. Well, as scientists, we are studying perhaps the greatest threat to our planetary environment, and we have a duty to explain that, to inform the public discourse. And if we don't step up and do that, we leave behind a vacuum that will be filled by some of the voices we've talked about, those with an agenda, those with an axe to grind, the fossil fuel industry, and those advocating for them. But when it comes to, so how far do we go? Informing the public discourse, what does that mean? Well, it can mean writing op-eds and letters to the editor and giving public lectures and testifying at hearings. It can go beyond that. It can mean getting arrested at pipeline protests. And I have scientific colleagues who have done that. We each have to decide, we have to be comfortable in our own skin, and we have to decide what makes the most sense for us. I don't think we can draw rigid boundaries as to how scientists can and should engage.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else want to add anything to that? Okay, so I think the next questions were sort of aimed towards Andy, which are kind of thinking about the barriers which, say, early career researchers or researchers in general might have in terms of getting involved in policy? Do you think that there might be barriers such as people are worried about their reputations or losing funding, or is it just, you know, a lack of resources and time?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and I think, you know, it sort of follows on from what Michael was saying about the difference between activism and advocacy. So I mean, anyone can be an activist right now. I mean, you can leave the session and, you know, walk out and go and start some protest somewhere right now. And, you know, it's, you can take many different actions, and of course there's varying ranges of comfort levels. And I always see sort of activism as a bit sort of less structured and sort of not necessarily organized. So it has a sort of low threshold for entry. But when you're talking about advocacy, I think that this is where there is a sort of high threshold for entry. And that's where, you know, a group like Astronomers for Planet Earth, if it so wanted, it could take on a kind of structured role, you know, maybe try and get some funding, and start searching for these kind of key events, you know, use volunteer resources to sort of do the groundwork and prepare and kind of organize. And then, you know, we can pull out our high status individuals, our Nobel Prize winners who have this very high legitimacy and credibility, and will attract media attention. And then they can be utilized and enlisted to transmit our message. So I think, yeah, you know, having a structure with this Astronomers for Planet Earth, you know, that's one way to kind of enlist people to start working towards the issue.
Thanks. There was a question from Victoria asking Karen if your experiences working on renewable energy research has really changed the way in which you do astronomy. Do you think it's made you a better astronomer? I know that you've already answered it. I'd like to hear from you as well.
Yeah, thank you. I wrote something in the Slack channel. I think that's a very interesting aspect of going outside of astronomy. So working with the engineers, I definitely saw more of a let's get this done mindset rather than the experimenting creative atmosphere that we have within astronomy, I think. And coming back to astronomy, I try to take that with me. So sometimes I get to the, how do you say, I take a method that works and just go with it rather than experimenting and trying to find something that works even better. It's a little hard to explain, but I think definitely mentality wise. And then I like to work with students, and I think having this actual experience helps you talk to them better about how their skills translate into other fields and why they should care about broader topics than just their current research. So, but that's kind of what I wrote in the Slack channel. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So probably another question for everyone, but I'd like to hear from Alison first. Is I'm wondering, yeah, about, especially in terms of communicating with the public or with anyone in general, is what are the lessons that we can learn from COVID? Perhaps a lot of mistakes that were made from trying to get people to act in time. And obviously we're already acting very late in terms of climate change, but is there anything in the communication world that we can learn from our COVID experience to apply it to climate change as well?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there is a huge amount that we can learn from COVID, from issues with mixed messaging and people being completely confused because they're being told one thing from one person and something else from another sort of member of the government, and they haven't got a clue really as to what they should be doing. Also, I think there was an issue early on in the pandemic when, particularly in the States, the reality of it was being completely played down, you know, and although perhaps people in government, you know, were concerned about it, they didn't want to panic the public. And that was a mistake because, you know, there was no sort of transparency. And I think people, weren't really prepared for the long haul of what it was actually going to involve. So I think there are a number of different lessons that we can learn from COVID for climate change.
Anyone else want to add anything to that?
Sure, I'm happy to add some thoughts. I agree with everything that Alison just said, and we could have an hour-long discussion easily about the lessons to be learned from the pandemic. And in my book, I spend a substantial part of the final chapter talking about the various lessons, the dangers of anti-science. We've seen them laid bare with the pandemic. The crisis unfolded on an accelerated timescale relative to, for example, the climate crisis. So we were actually able to watch these various stages of development where there was politically motivated attacks on the science and the scientists. Anthony Fauci here in the United States, vilified by Donald Trump and his supporters. There was an underlying ideological agenda. Trump saw the pandemic as a threat to his reelection chances, the economic slowdown and social distancing as a threat. And so for purely ideological and political reasons, chose to pursue an agenda of attacking and discrediting science that would have saved literally hundreds of thousands of human lives. Now, here's what's even more tragic. The climate crisis will, as I alluded to in my talk, cost far more lives if we fail to address it. So maybe we can take the lesson, this lesson that we've seen unfold in real time, the deadliness of not heeding what scientists have to say, to not listening to the lessons from the science. We were taught lessons about our fragility on this planet. A microscopic organism literally turned human civilization upside down for some period of time. And hopefully that sort of allows us to have a larger conversation about the fragility of nearly 8 billion people and growing global population competing for less food and water and space on a heated planet. And the list of things goes on. We can make a difference, right? The fact that we did see carbon emissions drop in response to changes that we made, even though, as I've said, lifestyle changes alone aren't going to accomplish the decarbonization of our economy, but they're important. I think, as Alison alluded to, it's important. We should engage in these individual actions that make us feel better. They save us money, and they set a good example for other people. We just can't allow that alone to be our model for action. We have to demand action on the part of our policymakers. So all of those lessons really, I think, and many more can be taken. And we should take that as an opportunity, as a teaching moment, to talk about the larger crises that we face. Even as we get past the pandemic, the climate crisis will still be there, and it's an even greater crisis.
Thank you. I also have another question for you, Michael, from Gina Maffey, which is, as a voluntary organization where many people are involved through passion, how can Astronomers for Planet Earth best contribute to the new climate war?
Well, hopefully to winning the war, as it were. This sort of gets back to what I was saying before. There's no one size fits all, approach to engagement as scientists. A good friend of mine and an inspiration and a mentor who's no longer with us, the great climate scientist Steve Schneider, who passed away some years ago, used to offer this simple lesson, and it was, know when you're engaging in public outreach efforts, know thy audience. And I think Alison spoke to that. Different messages are going to resonate with different audiences. Know thy audience, know thyself, understand your own sort of talents and abilities and skills and use them. Be yourself, be authentic. That's know thyself. And then finally, know thy stuff. And as scientists, we all know the importance of that. Know thy stuff, be informed. And not just about the science, but if you're going to talk about the larger challenges that we face that the science teaches us, and the public expects you to talk about that. And as a scientist, as I think it was, I forget who made this point now, we are entrusted. We're one of the most trusted messengers with the public, and that means we have a real opportunity, and we have to make the most of that opportunity. So don't just stop at the science. Ask the questions that your audience wants to hear answers to. What can we actually do? And I know Alison made that point, and I think some others did as well.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Another question, which was about CO2 emissions going down as a result of in the past year or two, and is that really because of less flying, or is there more to it? And how can we use that as a way to say, increase pressure on, it's not enough to just stop flying, there is so much more that we need to do?
Yeah, I would just say that we saw that it does make a difference. We made a dent in our emissions. They're somewhat temporary. So at the same time, it tells us that that alone isn't going to solve the problem. We need to decarbonize our economy, and we can't do that as individuals. We need our politicians to do that. But I think it does teach us that, individual action makes a difference, and we should all do those things that we can in our everyday lives that decrease our environmental impact. As I said before, it's the right thing to do. We feel better about ourselves. We set a good example for other people. But the most important thing we can do as individuals is band together, engage in collective action. What is a collection but a group of individuals working together, voting and using our voice in every way possible to inform the conversation? And that's why, I'm honored to be speaking to this audience in particular, because the astronomical community has you are asking and answering some of the biggest questions that we face as a civilization. Our place in the universe, is there life out there? All of these fundamental questions, everybody's interested in them. Your audience is interested in what you have to say. And so the astronomy and astrophysics community has a real opportunity to engage the public on the planetary system that is of greatest interest to us, because it's the only planetary system we know in the universe that can, thus far, that can support life. Take advantage of that opportunity to communicate.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. And one question for Andy, which is from Francesca: can a group like Astronomers for Planet Earth be both an activist and advocacy group, or are the two mutually exclusive?
I think that the answer is probably yes, and you probably should be. But obviously it depends, if you're getting into the area of sort of civil disobedience and, causing physical damage to things, then that might potentially undermine the credibility in other areas. But yeah, I think in general, yes, you have to do both. And we see organizations that have sort of different arms. They have the sort of political affairs group, which is doing the advocacy, and then they have groups that are sort of mobilizing the activists, and these two can coexist.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah. And I guess one final question for Alison, which is from Victoria, which is, we as astronomers are really used to communicating our astrophysics research, which is often loved by the audience, but there's, say, a lot of hesitation within the astronomy community to kind of start talking more about climate change, and perhaps scientists are a bit scared of that, or the reaction that they might get. Do you have any sort of tips or advice on astronomers that do want to kind of talk more about climate change, but are perhaps a bit worried to do so?
I think just make sure you are as informed as possible, and weave it in you know, to things that you know about, and think of examples that, you know, will be likely to be of interest to the audience. And the more you get involved in it, the more confident you'll be. And I think have a look at, as I say, those best practice guides, because there are numerous guides out there now which are incredibly useful, giving you all sorts of tips on how to go about communicating climate change. You don't have to be, you know, a complete expert in climate science. So I think, you know, that would be my response.
Yeah, perfect, great. Yeah, I guess as we're already over time, does anyone have any sort of final remarks or comments that they would like to share?
I guess I would just make the point that we are, you know, living in this moment right now. We're witnessing the profound impacts of climate change on our environment. And so this is a real moment of opportunity for the scientific community to engage the public. And as several speakers here spoke to, engage them not just by talking about the science and the impacts, but the solutions, the fact that there is urgency, but as I said before, there is agency. We can do this. And now really is our time. Let's take advantage of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I would just like to thank all of our speakers again, and so much for your time, especially as you're very, very busy people, and we really appreciate it. And we will definitely take all of your advice, and I've definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure others have as well. And yeah, hopefully for the future, we will see some really positive action and better communication from astronomers and advocacy and all of those things. So thank you again.